Well, if there was a Hall of Fame for UFO researchers, Dr. Kevin Randall would be one of the first inducted. He's best known as one of the original investigators of the world-famous Roswell UFO case. His best-selling book, UFO Crash at Roswell, was published in 1991 and became a critically acclaimed motion picture titled Roswell, which we will have a rare privilege of watching later today. Dr. Randall is highly respected in the UFO field and as an author has written over 100 books. And Dr. Randall is a veteran of both the Vietnam War and the Second Gulf War. He served in various roles ranging from helicopter pilot to director of intelligence. And this past November, he was awarded the Bronze Star, the Air Medal of Valor, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry for his service to our nation. Tonight at 7:30, Dr. Randall will bring us his unique insight into the Roswell incident, drawn from over his 20 years of investigating the case. Right now, he will be presenting a fascinating topic based on his latest book called The Government UFO Files. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Kevin Randall.
Well, I guess we need to get started. And for those of you who didn't know, that's what the book looks like. I have 8 of them left, by the way, so you might want to rush out and get it after this is over. That was my paid commercial announcement, by the way. When we look at the UFO phenomenon, we think of it, the modern era at least, beginning in June of 1947 with the Kenneth Arnold sighting. I don't think that's right. I think it began about 7 years earlier with what was called the Foo Fighters, which took place in World War II. This is a picture of what the Foo Fighters looked like for the most part. This picture, unfortunately, I believe would be a hoax, but it gives you an idea of the glowing balls of fire that they talked about. One of the first of these reports of the Foo Fighters took place at Tulagi, which was an island off Guadalcanal in August of 1942, right after the Marines invaded. And the fellow said that he was in his foxhole about 10 o'clock in the morning. He was cleaning his weapon, and the formation of these things flew overhead. He said he didn't think they were Japanese airplanes because they were flying much higher than the Japanese flew. He couldn't see any wings or tail assembly on them. And they were flying in a straight line formation, a trail formation as we called it in the military, as opposed to the V's that the Japanese normally did. And they didn't drop any bombs on them. This is one of the very first of the Foo Fighter reports, but it was not called Foo Fighters at that time. During the war, they also developed reports of what they called balls of fire, glowing balls of plasma, glowing balls of gas that came up toward the aircraft. Our guys would often fire on them. They'd see the bullets sometimes pass through the objects, sometimes they would bounce off of them. They didn't really know what they were, but it was something that was reported by our air crews in all theaters of the war during World War II, and it was something that concerned the military quite a bit because they didn't know exactly what they were. In 1944, a night fighter squadron, and these were guys that went up at night looking for the bad guys, reported that they were seeing these sorts of things as well, and one of them used the term foo fighter or faux fighter, something that wasn't true, and the term sort of stuck. So the term Foo Fighter began in 1944, but the sightings began actually at the very beginning of the war. What they did was they created in England what they called the Combined Intelligence Objectives Committee, which was a fancy name for a group of guys that got together trying to determine exactly what these things were. They were afraid that it was some kind of an enemy weapon system, and it was operating at a level that we obviously couldn't defend against. So they wanted to figure out what was going on, who was doing it, and if it was going to present a problem to the flight crews and our missions during World War II. One of the guys involved in this was a fellow named Howard McCoy. He had a history of being in intelligence, and his name will surface again and again and again. And another of the persons involved was Dr. H.P. Robertson, And those of you who know some of the history of UFOs realize that Robertson was the guy who did the famous Robertson panel in 1953, which was basically a CIA attempt to stop people talking about flying saucers by suggesting there's nothing to them, and that they should create an educational program to teach people that these things didn't exist, to kind of debunk the whole phenomenon. Now, this is Colonel Howard McCoy as he looked during the Second World War. I thought it would be nice to see what he looked like. And this, of course, is Dr. H.P. Robertson. Remember, they were in Great Britain, in England during the war. They were investigating the Foo Fighters. They were trying to figure out what exactly was going on. Now, many of you probably have heard of Len Springfield. He's the one that got us started on looking at these crash retrievals. He's the guy that began the investigation and legitimized the idea of crash retrievals in the UFO community. Prior to Len Springfield's work, most of us wouldn't even look at the story of a crash flying saucer because of a hoax that had taken place in the early 1950s. Len is important to this point because right after the end of the Second World War, he was on an aircraft taking off from Iwo Jima heading for Japan in September of 1945. He saw three objects coming close to the aircraft he was on. He said that as they approached, the engines began cutting out and sputtering. The pilot warned them that they may have to ditch, and he saw the three objects through the portholes on the side of the aircraft. Once they moved away from the aircraft, the engine smoothed out, and they didn't have to ditch in the ocean. So Len's experience with UFOs goes back to the Second World War, and I think this is what sparked his interest in flying saucers. When World War II ended, none of the belligerents, meaning the Allies, the Axis powers, the Japanese, nobody claimed the Foo Fighters. They didn't know whose they were. It turns out the Germans thought they were ours. The Japanese thought they were ours. We, of course, thought they were the Germans or the Japanese, and nobody knew what they were. But then the war was over, so nobody cared. So the investigations of the Foo Fighters kind of tapered off. And that was the end. Nobody was that interested in it anymore. It was a phenomenon that came out of World War II. The war is over. Let's move on. But in the summer of 1946, we start with the Swedish ghost rockets. The first reported sighting, interestingly enough, was from France, and it was an American flight crew on a C-54 flying over France. The guy saw something that he thought was a meteor, but he said that the trajectory wasn't quite right. It seemed to climb a little bit and then descend somewhat. That may have been one of the first of the ghost rocket sightings. They didn't know that at the time. But the first sighting that takes place in Scandinavia was on February 26th. I know you guys can read, I can't. It was over Helsinki, Finland, and it was numerous meteors falling. It was something that caught their attention. They thought they were meteors, but they'd never seen them clustering the way they did. So that was kind of the first thing, and people were talking about what was going on there. But then we moved into another description. The meteors gave way, and they started talking about the rockets looking like you would think a rocket. This is one of the illustrations taken from that time. And you can see it's got sort of a cigar shape. It's got these pods on the sides. It looks an awful lot like a German V-1 used during the Second World War. And the Russians had captured a great number of the V-1 rockets, so they thought it was some kind of a Soviet attempt to intimidate the Swedish. And look at that, I already did all that. This is, of course, an actual Soviet-captured V-1 rocket, so you can see what it looks like. And these, as I said, these were reported over Sweden, over Finland, mostly over the Scandinavian countries at this time. In May of 1946, started with more reports of fireballs, but in late May they started talking about cigar-shaped objects, and they were again talking about the rumors that they were V-bombs. They were the Soviets using those, flying them over Scandinavia. This is what one of the illustrations of what one of them thought it was, a cigar-shaped craft, which, of course, later on in the United States becomes something that's seen quite frequently. During the summer of 1946, the Swedes began their official investigation. They were that concerned about it. Something was going on, the people were seeing something real, something that they wanted to know what it was, and the Swedish military got involved in it. As the reports continued, and there seemed to be a bit of a hysteria among the population of Scandinavia, first Finland and then Sweden began a news blackout, which meant the military suggested to the media, or in this case the press, that they not talk about these things, and if they didn't talk about it, then the sightings would stop. Everybody was outside looking at them. It was creating this idea of hysteria. They produced a final report in December of 1946, and in that report, they didn't have a conclusion. They didn't know exactly what was going on. They thought the Soviets were involved, but they had no evidence of it. One of the guys who was involved in the investigation of this from the United States point of view, and the Swedes asked for our assistance, but they had to be careful, because now we run into diplomatic problems. Does the Swedish government want to involve the Americans in this investigation? Because this could antagonize the Soviets. That was the last thing they wanted to do. But as I said, one of the guys involved in this was Howard McCoy. He was looking into these cases unofficially. There was a lot of communications among the various embassies, the British embassy, the American embassy, talking about this, and a lot of top secret communications going back and forth, talking about exactly what this was. There were a lot of reports of these things crashing into the ground. A lot of them crashed in the ocean or in lakes where they couldn't get at the debris. They recovered debris from about 30 of these incidents, but they never identified the debris. They couldn't identify it as being Soviet. They couldn't identify it as being anything German. So they gathered these reports for many, many months. There was an official investigation done by our embassy guys about what was going on. And when Blue Book began in 1947, these reports were not part of the Blue Book system. And there's a reason that that is significant, and we'll get to that in a moment. But we have evidence that the United States government, through Howard McCoy and some other individuals, were gathering the information about the ghost rockets. There was an extraterrestrial component. Jerry Clark reported in his massive encyclopedia that a Swedish individual reported seeing the crew and interacting with the crew of one of these ghost rockets. The problem is the story came out in the 1970s, and there was no corroboration for it. And it didn't really fit in with all the rest of the reports that they were getting. The Soviet component is what everybody was expecting to come out, that the Soviet Union was doing this. They were testing some kind of weapon, some kind of aerial surveillance, and they were doing it over Sweden. But again, the evidence never came up. There was no final solution. Nobody knew what the ghost rockets were. When the Soviet Union collapsed, everybody thought, well, now we'll be able to get a hold of that information and we'll find out. But when they looked through the Soviet documentation, we found out the Soviets had nothing to do with it. So we really don't know what the ghost rockets were. There is no terrestrial explanation for a lot of those sightings. Sure, a lot of them were meteors. The photograph that you saw at the beginning of this is clearly of a meteor. But a lot of the stuff has no explanation for it. So now we move to 1947, and the flying saucers finally arrive. And yes, unfortunately, this picture is a hoax, but it shows a nice flying saucer with a dome disc on it. And it begins in June of 1947 with Kenneth Arnold. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Arnold's story of flying near Mount Rainier, seeing the objects in fast flight moving with a motion like flying saucers. What's interesting here is you've got a picture of his original report. He drew the object in the top illustration here of what it looked like in the side view and the top view and that sort of thing. And it became stylized later on into this crescent-shaped object that you see in the bottom picture. But Arnold was the first guy to talk about it. For some reason, this resonated with the press, and I've never figured out exactly how these things suddenly resonate. Arnold wasn't the first guy to talk about this. There had been reports going on prior to June of 1947, but Arnold's was the one that seemed to resonate with the media. In July of 1947, a guy in Phoenix, Arizona named Rhodes took these two photographs of an object. Notice the one looks an awful lot like the first illustration that Arnold had made. It's even got the cockpit in the middle. Rhodes said that he was in his backyard walking to his home laboratory, and he saw this object. He grabbed his camera, he took a picture of it. There were only 2 frames left, so he took one picture. In today's world with our cell phones, we'd be taking like videotape or videos and several photographs, but he only had the 2 pictures. As the object began to move away, he took the second one, which is kind of a streak of what the object looked like, so it's not a good solid picture like the first one. The Air Force investigated. They decided that this was a hoax. They didn't like William Rhodes' lifestyle, I think. He was a self-styled scientist. He had his big laboratory. He had letterhead printed up for panoramic research laboratories. And the Air Force took exception to this because they figured he was just some nutball that created this organization. But when you look into Rhodes' background, you discover that he held any number of patents. He was an inventor. He had patented stuff. He was living on the royalties of his patent. But the Air Force didn't bother to learn that sort of thing. Instead, they were busy smearing him as some kind of a crackpot and the photographs being a hoax. What scared them was they had the Arnold sighting and what he'd looked like, what he'd said he'd seen, and just days later, on July 7th, 1947, Rhodes in Phoenix takes a photograph of it. Now you've got 2 very good sightings going on with solid witnesses, and you've got photographic evidence. So the Air Force was a little bit concerned, or I probably should say the Army Air Forces at the time. Beginning in December of 1946, something you probably haven't heard about, the unofficial investigation of UFOs, flying discs in the United States began. This is months before Arnold. There was a telephone call into what was called T2, and that's an intelligence section at Wright Field. It interrupts a Christmas party, and they're told to set up this investigation. The orders were apparently relayed through Nathan Twining. He was a commanding general of the Air Material Command at Wright Field at the time. He's telling him, we want an investigation into this. Well, there's Nathan Twining. He eventually becomes the Air Force Chief of Staff. So here's a guy that's on the road to ultimate success in the military, well-decorated hero from World War II, and of course that's Wright-Patterson Field now, where all of this sort of stuff is housed. This was in the Foreign Technology Building at Wright-Patterson at the time, and you can see the cars should give you kind of an idea of the date. So what was done was this officer was ordered to create this new unofficial investigation. What was his name? Howard McCoy. What he does is he sets up a room in the building. He and another guy are the only ones that have keys. They began their unofficial investigation there. They're keeping the files. He's got all the stuff on the Ghost Rockets. He's got all the stuff on the Foo Fighters. He's now looking into reports of flying discs in the United States. And yes, there were sightings prior to Arnold. They just weren't reported until after Arnold. And there's reports of a lot of different things going on. Howard McCoy is the guy that begins the unofficial investigation of UFOs, flying saucers, in the United States. Once we got to the Arnold sighting, they've already got all these files set up. This eventually evolves into the real investigation of UFOs, the official investigation. So these guys are running this bootleg operation in one room where only 2 or 3 guys can get into it. They're gathering the data. They're keeping it under lock and key. Nobody knows what they're doing. It's an unofficial investigation. It's funded through various financial sources on the base, so they have to be very careful of what they're doing. But then they luck out because suddenly they can start an official investigation and all that sort of thing goes away. And we have what's called an estimate of the situation. In intelligence work, when you have a phenomenon, when you have a problem and something's going on, you create a document called an estimate of the situation so that you can analyze all the data that you have. This was requested by Brigadier George Shogun. He's in the Pentagon. He's been hearing about all this information coming in about the flying saucers, the flying discs. There's a lot of talk in the newspapers after Arnold's sighting. And if you looked at the newspapers, you can see every day they've got some kind of story about flying saucers. Some of them are kind of funny. One of them said, flying saucers seen in 20 states except Kansas. The joke was Kansas was a dry state. couldn't drink alcohol in Kansas, so that created that. This was an estimate of the situation was created by a guy named George Garrett, and it was made up of 18 UFO sightings. Now, this document itself no longer exists. We don't have a copy of it, but we know what was in it based on other correspondence that took place around this time. The first case, for example, came from Manitou Springs, Colorado. And for those of you not from Colorado, you would know that you don't know that Manitou Springs is just south of Colorado Springs. This was a multiple witness sighting, so this got them excited. It's not just one guy, it's a whole bunch of people, and it was observed through optical instruments. What does that mean? Optical instruments? They had a pair of binoculars, so they could watch it close up. But it was something that was seen for a period of time. They got a good look at it. There was a number of people who saw it. It's a good, solid sighting. There was another sighting from Oklahoma City, and Garrett liked this sighting because it was made by a civilian pilot. He wasn't flying at the time. He's on the ground. He sees the object in the sky. He sees it for a short period of time, but as a pilot. And the assumption by these guys in the Army Air Forces is that pilots make good observers because they know what's in the sky around them. They're used to being up there. They know what to look for. They know what aircraft look like. They know what kind of optical illusions you'll see when you are looking around. One of the sightings, of course, was the Arnold sighting. They were very impressed with that. In June 28th, you got 4 Army officers, 2 pilots, 2 intelligence officers on the ground in Alabama. And they watched something in the sky for several minutes. So to get a good look at it. And one of the problems we've had with a lot of UFO sightings is, well, I saw it for 2 or 3 seconds. Well, you don't get a good look at something in 2 or 3 seconds. And there's a lot of optical illusions that can come into play, but if you get a look at it for a minute, or 2 minutes, or 5 minutes, you've got a good look at it, well, then the optical illusions and the mistaken identity pretty much goes away. Another sighting that excited everybody in the country was on July 4th by E.J. Smith. And for those of you who are well enamored with Titanic mythology, E.J. Smith was the name of the captain of the Titanic. And Captain E.J. Smith of United Airlines, he and his crew and the pilot and the passengers in the airplane saw a number of flying saucers outside, paced the aircraft for quite a period of time. Smith becomes important also because during the Maury Island investigation, and I believe Maury Island to be a hoax, this was a UFO seen over Puget Sound, supposedly dropped some debris, and it was collected by these 2 harbor patrolmen. A fellow named Ray Palmer, who was running a science fiction magazine, asked Arnold to investigate this. So Arnold went down to look at it, and he felt out of his depth. So he called E.J. Smith, and Smith came down, and they looked at it together. They weren't really sure what to do. They called the 2 Army officers who had interviewed Arnold, and they came up to investigate. That led to the B-25 crash that killed the 2 officers, which takes us off in a bizarre tangent. But it just shows that Arnold and Smith were involved together in investigating UFOs, and Smith's sighting is considered very credible by the military, because again, he's a pilot, it's multiple witness, they got a good look at these disc-shaped objects pacing the aircraft. July 6th, you've got an Army Air Forces pilot observing something. They're very, very impressed with that. So the estimate of the situation in the book, I list all 16 sightings. I didn't want to go through that here because I thought it would bore the hell out of you. But it contained 16 sightings. The majority of them, I said, were military or pilots. A lot of them were multiple witnesses. They believed, when they wrote this estimate of the situation, they believed, given the timing, that the answer was terrestrial technology. They believed that it was some kind of research and development project being conducted by the United States. They just weren't aware of it because they didn't have the need to know of what was going on. So they thought by creating this, they would get an answer that they would be happy with, and they could stop looking at these sorts of things. But the thing was, this estimate of the situation contained no physical evidence. Nothing had been picked up. They didn't deal with the photograph. They didn't deal with the radar. No physical evidence there. The cases were based on the testimony of the people and the credibility of the people who were giving the testimony. And they asked AMC for analysis. This is Twining's group. McCoy was involved in it. That's where they go for this because they figured the Air Material Command, which is heavily involved with research and development, would be the guys that would know what was going on. They expected the answer to be, Don't worry about it. We know what's happening. You can stop now. In a letter dated September 23rd, 1947, much to the surprise of Garrett and Chauvin, they were told that the phenomenon was something real. It was not visionary or fictitious. Something's going on. They're told that based on this testimony, these objects are metallic and they have reflecting surfaces. Now, at about this time, you get the skyhook balloons, which are these polyethylene things, and at great distances it would look like it's metallic. So they say reflecting surfaces. It may not be metallic, but it's some kind of highly polished surface. But they also say that the craft seem to be circular, they seem to be flat-bottomed, and they have domes on the top of them. We're not talking about balloons here. We're talking about something else. But they also mention, and this is what the skeptics love, there's a lack of crash-recovered debris. This analysis, put together during the summer of 1947, is after Roswell. So the skeptics say, well, there's no crash-recovered debris. I say, yeah, because there was nothing about that sort of thing in the estimate of the situation that was written by Garrett. This analysis is based solely on what he had submitted to them. They didn't bring anything of their own knowledge into it. If Roswell happened and Roswell was extraterrestrial, this would be more highly classified than this estimate of the situation. They would be prohibited to mention it. But it's interesting they mention the lack of crash-recovered debris. If you're told something doesn't exist, you don't bother looking for it. I think that was part of the strategy here. But they also said we need to continue to investigate. We need to create a special project to investigate these sorts of things. This has a high priority. It was, I think, classified 2A, which is the second highest priority they had. So it's something that's very important to the guys at the Air Materiel Command. This is the beginning of Project Psi. The name was classified. They called it Project Saucer in the public arena. But this is the official investigation. I just said all of that. But who was the officer who did the majority of work on the letter and who's responsible for the conclusions in it? Howard McCoy. You see the connection here? McCoy investigated the Foo Fighters. McCoy investigated the Ghost Rockets. He's involved in the unofficial investigation that's going on, guaranteeing all this information. Now he's given this material from Garrett. He's to analyze it and prepare the letter for Twining's signature. Twining signed it as the chief or the commander of Air Materiel Command. McCoy is the guy who wrote it. McCoy obviously knew about Roswell. He knew about a lot of other things, but that wasn't in the document he was responding to. He was not obligated to mention anything about it. So what have we got here for the first decade of the government files? Well, the Foo Fighters were seen in all theaters. They were reported by both sides. No solution was found for them. The Ghost Rockets in Scandinavia. First reports in 1946, not long after the war, after the Foo Fighters stopped. They investigated it officially. No solution was found for them. And then we get the flying discs in 1947. The first sightings predate Arnold. I've spent a lot of time going through newspapers looking for sightings that were reported prior to Arnold that talk about a disc shape from like January 1947 to Arnold's sighting. I haven't found anything that predates it. There's a lot of stories afterwards where they're talking about disc-shaped objects. And a lot of people said, well, I didn't think anybody believed it. I didn't think anything about it. They came forward after Arnold. This was the beginning of the official investigation. Arnold kind of sparked this whole thing, the Arnold sighting. What we find is we have American interest in all three. Obviously the Foo Fighters because of the possibility of being some kind of German weapon. The investigations of the Foo Fighters were carried out in secret. The American involvement in the Ghost Rockets was carried out in secret. Understandably, given the problems in the world at the time that the Swedish didn't want us involved, but it was carried out in secret. And Howard McCoy is involved in all three. He's the thread that connects it all together. But we're not talking just about these boring stuff. And I go into this minutia, and I know that some people are going, oh, who cares? It's not really exciting. But to understand the history of the UFO phenomenon, you have you have to understand these other things. And I know of no other place where we've been able to connect it together through one individual in this case. One guy who was involved in all the investigation. One guy who knows what's going on. He was there for the Foo Fighters. He was there for the Ghost Project. He was investigating disc reports prior to Arnold. He knows all of this stuff, and he's controlling the information. And then we get to the Roswell case, and he suddenly got the answer, but he's not going to share it with us. So we move into the alien creatures in the government files. And it's long been said that there's only one case in the Project Blue Book files involved occupants that's unidentified, and that was Socorro in 1964. Almost every other case where people reported some sort of alien creature, the government wrote it off as psychological problem, because that was a label. You know, they not only see objects in the sky, now they're seeing creatures from another world. These people must be crazy. So Lonnie Zamora was a police officer in Socorro. He's chasing a speeder. He goes up over a crest. He hears a roar. He thinks a dynamite shed is blown up on the outskirts of town. So he goes over to see what's going on. He crests the hill. He looks down and he sees what he thinks is an overturned car. He stops his patrol car. He gets out. He sees two creatures outside the craft. So you've got an egg-shaped craft sitting on its landing gear just outside of Socorro, New Mexico. You have a police officer. He sees two guys in white coveralls. They seem to spot him, become frightened. They clamber back into the craft, and it takes off with a roar, flame underneath, and it shoots off into the wind, which becomes important. There's a mark from the exhaust of the craft. There's the landing gear indentations that are found later. The problem is, this is a single witness case. We've got one guy who saw it, which is Lonnie Zamora. Yeah, there was landing traces left behind, but I'm wondering about a chemical rocket. You've been able to travel interstellar distances. That would suggest your technology is something better than a chemical rocket, because you'd need a hell of a big fuel pod to travel an interstellar distance with a chemical rocket. There's something else. Possibly their landing craft are set up so that they use that kind of system to get off. I don't know. There was the time when everybody thought that it was the lunar lander being tested at White Sands, which isn't all that far from Socorro, and it had drifted off the range, and Zamora had seen that. Of course, in 1964, they'd want to keep that covered up. But now, when there's no reason to keep it secret, we can find no evidence that an incident like that happened. The lunar lander, although being tested in that time frame at White Sands, did not get off the range. But the important point is the Air Force investigated, they left it unidentified. Now, our favorite skeptic, Philip Klass, investigated, and he said, well, he found a guy who lived no more than 1,000 feet away, and he didn't hear a thing. And he said, in fact, he said the guy was out working in his garden, so if this had happened, he should have seen something, and he should have heard something. Well, it turns out the guy lived a lot further away. He wasn't in his garden, he was in the house. And he also said that he didn't see anybody. After all of this went on, he for some reason walked over there and he didn't see anybody, which really defeats his credibility, simply because Zamora called his boss, who called somebody else, and for the next several hours there were a great number of people on the site of this landing. So although Zamora is the only guy that saw the thing, I think, I'll explain that in a moment, there were a lot of people who were on the scene right after it. They saw the landing depressions, they saw the burnt bush, and all of that sort of thing, and they gathered evidence. And I say it's single witness. Now, there were two guys from Dubuque, Iowa, and in the Dubuque newspaper, about a week later, they explained they had been driving home from New Mexico, and they actually saw the craft fly over. The two guys' names are known to investigators. They were interviewed by another UFO investigator a couple of years later, and they said, well, it's a hoax, it never happened, we didn't see anything. I'm not convinced that that's the true solution, and I've spent the last couple of years trying to find these two guys. They've disappeared off the face of the earth. But it would be nice if we could talk to them and find out what the true story was, because it would either provide corroboration for Lonnie and Zamora or would remove their names from the case. But this was one of the few cases in the Project Blue Book files that was labeled unidentified. But as I was looking through the Project Blue Book files, I came to another one from Temple, Oklahoma on March 23rd, 1966, 2 years after Zamora. It's also labeled as unidentified, and it also involves a witness who saw the creature. Now, he provided to Project Blue Book an illustration of what this thing looked like. And you see the porthole there. He said that he could see the pilot or one of the crew members through this porthole as he was working in the craft. And you see we have what may be his representation of the creature there. And this is just the other side of the craft. So this guy's name was Eddie Laxton. The UFO landed next to the road. And looking through this, he sees what he thinks is a human inside the craft. So he thinks it's some kind of an experimental craft being used by the military. He's talking about the, wrong button. He's talking about the guy wearing a baseball cap backwards. I'm not sure it's backwards. We're wearing a baseball cap, looking very human. There was another witness, C.W. Anderson. He saw the object in the sky. He didn't see the occupants. He didn't see it on the ground, but he saw it up in the air. But he did not complete Air Force Form 117. That was their big, stupid questionnaire, which left a great gaps in the knowledge they should have been gathering, the intelligence they would say they should have been gathering. He did not complete the form. Therefore, he did not exist as a witness. The Air Force was famous for that. If they didn't talk to you, you weren't a witness. Even though everybody else knew you'd seen this thing, you weren't a witness. They could not find any conventional explanation for this. And as I said, this strikes me as sort of odd simply because they had a habit of saying, well, if you saw the creatures, it was psychological. But he wasn't really talking about an alien creature. He was talking about some kind of human in the craft. So that might be why they labeled the case as unidentified. Also found another one near Pittsburgh, Kansas from August 25th, 1952. And it's kind of similar to the other case. Saw the UFO hovering over a field, saw a creature through the window. It was a human-like creature. So you're not talking about some kind of bizarre alien, you're talking about a human-like creature. He was the only one that saw it, but he went back to work and he told his friends about it. And these other witnesses went to it and they found what we would call a saucer nest at the time. And now it would be a crop circle. But they found an area, a circular area in the grass that had been matted down by the thing. They took some soil samples, but nothing unusual was found. Took it from underneath where the craft was, took it from inside the crop circle, took it from an area 200 to 300 meters away to get a control. They found nothing unusual in the samples. General Hynek was the Air Force consultant for Project Blue Book, and when that case first came in, Hynek thought it was a hallucination. He just wrote it off. Later on, in the 1960s, as Hynek began to review more and more of the information that the Air Force was gathering, and realizing that the investigation wasn't all that great, changed his mind about this. And if you take a look at, I think it's the Hynek UFO report, he talks a little bit about this case and that he changed his mind and thinks this is a solid case. So what we have is another case. Physical evidence was found. Nobody bothered to photograph the crop circle. They could see the footprints of the first witness as he walked up to the fence where the object was hovering. They could see the flattened grass. They could see other footprints with other people who walked up later on. So there is evidence, physical evidence, but it's single witness. But still, the Air Force concluded it was unidentified. And I'm convinced the reason the Air Force did that was because he wasn't talking about a creature, he was talking about a human. This was a photograph taken over Cedar Rapids, Iowa in the 1950s, and unfortunately this is a hoax. But they always illustrate what I want to say, so I include those in there. So we have the Foo Fighters from 1947. No solution was found. Colonel Howard McCoy investigates. We have the Ghost Rockets from 1946. No solution was found. Colonel Howard McCoy investigates. And then finally the flying saucers arrive. I don't think a solution has been found. Howard McCoy investigates. In fact, he's kind of directing some of this investigations. We have the mini estimate of the situation, which inspired the letter from Twining, but was written by Howard McCoy, that the phenomena is something real and not fictitious. But you see the connection here. One guy directing all of this, and we keep hearing, well, there's nothing to it, there's nothing to it, there's nothing to it, but this guy knows what's going on. So what this does is move the history of the UFO phenomenon from June 24th, 1947 with Kenneth Arnold, all the way back to the Foo Fighters. You have the Foo Fighters. I think the first Foo Fighters sighting was in like 1940, and it was a British sighting. I just used the ones from the American side of the world, or the conflict, but they were also in the Pacific. They were also over the China, India, Burma theater in that area. They were seen in the European theater. There are some reports of creatures in the government files. These guys were seen in Kelly-Hopkinsville in 1956. Now, the Air Force says, we never investigated, but there's a file for them in the Project Blue Book files. And the investigation was done by a number of military officers. One of them, I think, was just on the scene. He saw some stuff, he talked to the people, he filed a report. So it wasn't an official investigation, but there was a request from the Air Force to the UFO officer at Godman Army Airfield, Fort Campbell, Kentucky area, to take a look into this thing. And what happened here was one of the family members saw some object landing out behind the house. They went inside the house, and for the next several hours, these little creatures are running around outside the house, and the family's in there shooting at it with shotguns, with rifles. And when the sheriff goes out to investigate the next morning, see the bullet holes and the screams and everything. They said they would hit the creatures, knock them down, they'd jump up and run off. One of them was seen up on the roof. They fired at it, it fell off the roof, it ran off. The next day they found some material off in one of the fields that may have been related to the UFO. They didn't know, but the Air Force never sent an investigator. They knew about the case, it was on the radio, it was reported to them. They never really sent an investigator. They determined that the witnesses, the Langsford, were very, very religious people, and they'd been to a Pentecostal revival meeting, and they were just all enthused and pumped up for being at the revival meeting, so they were hallucinating. And what they were seeing was monkeys escaped from a circus. Of course, there was no circus in the area for the monkeys to escape from, but that's okay. We had an explanation, and everybody was happy in the Air Force. Because they were little creatures, and this is an illustration of what they sort of looked like. So that kind of takes us through a brief history of the government UFO files, shows us what we can learn by studying these documents. And all of this stuff is documented. You know, I can look at the files, I can see this stuff. You guys can look at the files and see this stuff. So it's not something that we're based solely on testimony of the witnesses, as so often happens in the UFO field, but there's documentation so you can follow the trail. The FBI, for example, would say, well, after 1947, we never really investigated UFOs. We weren't involved in this. They were involved in the beginning because Brigadier General Shulgin asked for the FBI assistance in talking to the witnesses, figured that would be a good thing for them to do. Hoover agreed to do it, but he didn't like the way the Air Force responded to him or what they're withholding information, so he bowed out of the investigation, allegedly. I found in the government files a document from 1960 where an FBI agent was filing a report that he'd gone to a contactee meeting, I think it was George Van Tassel, in the Denver area. So he put together a report, an official report, of this UFO convention. Any FBI guys here, by the way? Sat in the back, just watched what was going on, explained what had happened, and said that the audience, unfortunately, and I see it's sort of here too, was graying, made up mostly of women who were really excited about the message being given by Van Tassel, and I believe it was Van Tassel. And that was sort of it. But what this shows is, why would an FBI agent go to a contactee meeting in the 1960s? And why would he feel the necessity of filing a report? Obviously, the FBI was interested in this stuff. Hoover, being the nut bar he was, may have thought there was some kind of communist plot going on here, simply because in the contactees, they often talked about these egalitarian societies, which I guess the FBI was against, and suggested it might be providing a communist influence to these people. I'm not sure if that's a correct analysis. I just know that was kind of Hoover's mindset. But what we find through the documentation, the FBI was involved. We find through the documentation, and this is kind of interesting, something called Project Moondust. Well, when that first leaked into the public arena in the 1960s, Senator Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico sent a letter to the Congressional Liaison Office and asked if there was a Project Moondust and what it was. And he got a response back from the Air Force and said, no, that never existed. There was no such project. Through FOIA, the State Department had screwed up, and I think that's kind of par for the course for the State Department, but they released a bunch of documents, and on the subject line it often said Moondust. So the documents were sent on to the Congressional Liaison Office, and a higher ranking officer now wrote back and said, yeah, Moondust existed, but we never used it. Well, that's not true either. Well, what's interesting, I was looking for a case in the Project Blue Book files, and I'm scanning the microfilm, and it seems like the word Moondust goes by. So I go back. I found 4 cases in the Project Blue Book files from 1960 labeled Moondust. So we knew Moondust was involved in UFO investigations. We know they coordinated some stuff with Project Blue Book. The cases that were in the Project Blue Book files are really cruddy cases. You know, somebody saw something for like 2 seconds off in the distance, and it probably was a meteor. But they're there, proving that Moondust existed in 1960. I actually found a letter dated December of 1957 that says, you've got a new project named Moondust, so we know it was created about the time of Sputnik. And its mission was to recover returning space debris of foreign manufacture, Soviet, or unknown origin, UFO. When we look at the Moondust files, we find they deployed any number of times. Most of what they recovered was garbage. I think one of the things they recovered was the external fuel tank from the jet that had fallen. People had seen it fallen, and they didn't know what it was. So Moondust deployed. So when we look at the documentation from the government files, we see an awful lot of this sort of thing going on, and we can, so we document all of this material. So when the military says we didn't investigate, we can prove that they did. When they said there was nothing to it, we can prove that there was. It's all available, but it's all buried in these reams and reams of paper. Project Blue Book investigated 12,000 sightings. They said of those 12,000, only 700 were unidentified. But if you look at the classifications, you find out 4,000 were labeled insufficient data for scientific analysis, which means they weren't identified. So you've got half of the files that were never identified, and oftentimes there's no information that is missing. You've got a time, you've got a date, you've got a location, you've got a witness name. What more information do you need to investigate? All they did was send out their stupid form and then say, well, we have insufficient data for scientific analysis. So a great number of the cases are not identified. So like I say, what I've attempted to do here is recreate the known history of the UFO phenomena, taking it from the Foo Fighters up to today. Moondust was eventually replaced by another project. All we know is that the name was classified, and we haven't been able to crack that one yet. So that's where we are. This, I hope, gives you an idea of how convoluted this topic has become because of the attempts by the government to conceal the information. And you can understand for World War II them wanting to conceal the information. You can understand when Roswell happened them wanting to conceal the information. They didn't know what was going on. But I can think of no reason for them to continue today. So we need just to keep investigating the UFOs, looking for some answers that will be satisfactory to a large number of people. And say, yeah, this is the proof, this is the evidence, and here's where you go to find it. Are there any questions? I would like to try to leave time for questions. Yes? This information about McCoy is pretty new. I don't know when he died. You probably look him up and find out he's still alive. He's about 800 years old. But nobody has followed that path because we've just been able to establish this link. And I thought about trying to find McCoy, but I'm always hesitant to talk to relatives because now you've got it filtered through somebody else. And if McCoy is an intelligence guy, he would have been talking to the family about it anyway. And that's one of the problems we have. You have to understand, in this, there's sort of like 2 or 3 levels. There's people who are involved in the intelligence work who understand the classifications and that you're not supposed to talk about it. Then there's guys who have the clearances and they know some of this stuff, but they figure the time is over. They can talk about it, so they give us some information. And there's some that really never understood it at all. I called a guy named Cruikshank. He had been a general officer. He had been in charge of ATEC, Air Technical Intelligence Center, in the 1960s. And I called him, and he said to me very, very short, very sharply, "I don't know who you are. I don't know what is still classified. I'm not going to talk to you." Click. So you have to be careful. But with someone like McCoy, I would suspect he didn't talk to anybody. But following the prospector's code, you always look, just in case, is something that we're attempting to do. Yes?
I apologize for walking a little bit late. I saw the screen, you had some dates in July. In the very beginning, you had some dates in July. What year was that?
I think you're talking about 1947.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe it was last year because I've got pictures on July the 5th or something.
Well, the photographs on there were taken, that I was using, were taken on July 7th, 1947 in Phoenix. And we were dealing with a lot of material from 1947 to kind of link all of the stuff together.
Did I show you the stuff I had?
Yes, yes, certainly. Yes.
In Oshkosh, Wisconsin, 20 years ago, I saw a flying disc built 50 years earlier, 1930, and it was in flying condition and retractable landing gear, and it was, I don't know for how long it was there in exhibition. I spent half hour looking at it. It had a propeller cut about 1/3 from the leading edge, and on both sides of the propeller was flat. So the engine was in the middle of the, what from the side looked like an airfoil, but it looked like an Arnold picture. Now, that was in 1930. Model A technology, we have retractable landing gear, the cockpit, fluid. Now, can you imagine what they have now? The government compiled.
In our investigation of the Roswell case, we looked into what were called flying wings, or tailless aircraft. And some of the first designs go back to, I think, 1909. And the Horten brothers in Germany were creating flying wings at the time, as was Northrop here in the United States. They had a contract to create a medium range or a long range bomber, flying wing type bomber. They never got the thing done before World War II ended. And the problem is they're inherently unstable. They tend to flip. And the flying wing we have now, of course, has computers to compensate for all of that. So there's a lot of aircraft that were created throughout that time frame that have very bizarre looks to them. There was something called the flying flapjack, which is I thought you were describing when you began, but the propellers were in the rear of it. And it looked sort of like the Arnold thing. It had a couple of tail-like assemblages in the front, but it only flew a couple of times or one time near Bridgeport, Connecticut. And it never developed beyond that, but you see pictures of it all the time. It's called the flying flapjack. So we've got the flying wings, we've got those sort of things, so I'm not sure what you may have seen at that time.
The Horton brothers were after World War II, of course. And the first cousin of mine.
Well, let me just for everybody, the Horten brothers were German designers, so they were working in Germany. So.
Right. Well, after 1947, they arrived in Argentina. They were working very fancy projects. And the first cousin of mine worked there in and he never told me what he was doing. And then, about 15 years ago, I went to see him. He was 80 years old. I said, why don't you tell me what you were working over there with the Messerly, Morton Brothers, and quite a few other German scientists. Then he said, okay, I'm going to tell you when you get back to this time. And when did you see him 10 years ago? He died. So that's the end of the story.
Yeah, in our research for Roswell, we've went into, I called some guy on the day of his funeral, which was really sad, and his widow wanted to chat. And I'm thinking, well, I've kind of interrupted this thing. Maybe I ought to chat for a minute with her. I mean, it's just kind of, you've got an opportunity to get some information, and you've lost it now forever. No. What we're going to do this afternoon, we had the Roswell, the UFO crash at Roswell, and some of the subsequent information was made into the movie for Showtime called Cleverly Roswell, so you know exactly what it's about. And so I'll begin by giving a little bit of information about the movie, and how it began, how it came about, some of the things went on during the shooting of the film, which I found fascinating, but maybe nobody else will. And I think that will be done at start at 4:30 this afternoon. And then this evening at 7:30, I'll be giving a talk specifically about the Roswell case, what has gone on since then. I'll spend a little bit of time going into the minutia of Project Mogul, only because all the time I get the people saying to me, well, we know what it was this top secret Project Mogul balloon. Well, no, it wasn't, and here's why. And I think it's important. It's easy for the skeptics to say, well, it was a Project Mogul balloon, and that's the end of the discussion. They don't have to provide any evidence. They don't have to say anything. We've got an answer. To refute that takes a little bit of time to understand exactly what was going on and to give an idea of the level of research we've done. We even have the diary from the guy who was leading the project, Dr. Albert Crary. And contrary to popular belief, it was actually the Air Force investigators that got the diary. And then they published the whole thing for us so that we could see what was going on. But I'll talk about that, and I'll talk about some of the new stuff that's going on, including the rumors of the slide of the alien creature that were discovered a couple of years ago. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So we've got a lot of Roswell stuff going on this afternoon. The movie, if nothing else, is a good movie. It's fun, and if you know where to look, you will see me in it. But you have to know where to look. And I sometimes miss myself, so there you go. Are we done? Do we have any more questions while we're all gathered here?
Have you had any negative things come because of your investigation since you were in the military?
No. And that's kind of interesting. I mean,
threats to you or people telling you?
almost my entire military career, I've had a top secret clearance, and they have to update those every 5 years. And when I got the first top secret clearance, the guy who was doing the background investigation for the Air Force happened to live across the street from my father. So we talked to him about it, and he said, yeah, we found your articles you'd written that were nasty about the Air Force. It didn't make any difference. I got the clearance. When I went into the National Guard after 9/11, and I had to update the background investigation for the top secret clearance, everybody knew what I'd been doing, and nobody seemed to care. They would talk to me about being the UFO guy. And in fact, in Iraq one day, these two NCOs come up to me and they say, "Do you have a brother?" I said, "No, why?" They said, "Well, we were watching this documentary on the History Channel the other day, and there was a guy with the same last name, and he looked a lot like you." I said, "Yeah, that was me about 15 years ago." But the one thing you have to understand, in Iraq, we had satellite dishes. You know, the soldiers had a satellite package that got the History Channel, the one that we had in the Tactical Operations Center, which I called my open source intelligence, the cable. We didn't get the History Channel, but I remember watching Stargate on it several times, so it wasn't a complete loss. But I've never had a problem. I was sort of known as the UFO guy. One of the first sergeants asked me about that one day. And I said, well, how do you like being known as the NASCAR guy? Because he was really a NASCAR. And he said he didn't mind at all. So yeah, that kind of thing. But I never had a problem with my military career related to UFOs. I got the clearances I needed and could do the stuff. I never saw, that's not quite right. I didn't see any real classified material about UFOs. There was something called the Weekly Intelligence Brief that I used to see, and there were unclassified sections of it, and periodically there'd be a UFO report in there, and it was nothing spectacular. The one I remember, some flight crew near Japan reporting that they'd seen an orange object that followed them for a while and then took off. And it was in the paragraph was unclassified, and the document itself, the Weekly Intelligence Brief, I think, had an overall classification of secret. So if you know how this works, you can put unclassified stuff in these things. Each paragraph is marked with like an S for secret or a TS, and the overall document is classified at the highest level of the classified material in it. So if you've got secret material in it, the overall document is secret, even though there was unclassified stuff in it. But I never had any trouble. Yes?
As an artist, I'm fascinated by so that infiltrates a lot of my work. And one of the things that I'm sometimes interested in, I want to ask you, have you come in contact with some of the researchers that are studying some of the sightings from ancient cultures that would happen in religious texts and stuff like that?
Well, a lot of that stuff is open to interpretation. And I know, I forget whose army it was, we cruised across a river because they saw a fiery shield in the sky. What the hell is a fiery shield? Well, we can interpret that as some kind of a glowing disc-shaped object, but we don't know. So it's hard to tell what the ancients were talking about, because they didn't understand meteors, they didn't understand comets, they didn't understand a lot of these phenomena. There was, to move it forward, there's a sighting from Omaha, Nebraska of the great airship of 1897, and they're talking about it had bright white blue headlight in the western sky. I'm absolutely convinced they were looking at Venus. But because of all the talk about the airship, they thought this was the headlight on the airship. So when you move into those arenas, you have to be very careful on how you interpret what they actually meant. In one of the books I did, and unfortunately I've sold all the copies, called Alien Mysteries, which I thought of as kind of a brief history of UFOs, but the publisher didn't like that title. They always like to get conspiracy on the front cover. But I looked at a lot of the ancient sightings up through it, and the other thing that I wanted to do was talk about Ezekiel and his wheel, because he was in Babylon when he made the sighting, and I had photographs that I had taken in Babylon. And so I'm trying to figure out how can I get these photographs in a book, because I have photographs of Babylon and not everybody has those. But so that's I cover that stuff, but and that's what I really say. It's really kind of open to interpretation. You have to be careful labeling it as extraterrestrial when it may have been something else. When I studied anthropology, the one thing that always kind of cracked me up, they'd find some object in a site, and they weren't sure what it was, and they said, well, this has religious significance. That was their catch-all for, I don't know what it is, but it was probably religious in nature. And so I think, that we got some of that with the ancient astronaut stuff. Well, I don't know what it is, but it's probably alien. Well, it may not be. We've got to be careful on our interpretations. He says I can have one more question. Yes?
J. Allen Hynek started as a skeptic, but he didn't end up as a skeptic.
I would say he probably started out as a debunker.
Yeah, as a debunker, exactly. But that's not where he ended up. Do you have any insight as to some of the critical things that changed his thinking along the way?
Well, when he began, he was hired as a consultant to Project Sign, and because they wanted an astronomer, and he was handy. And so his contract kept getting renewed, and he would be looking at the UFO sightings, and he would see an awful lot of the things were fairly mundane, and he would know, well, this is really Venus, or this really is a meteor. I mean, and you look at the sightings, that answer makes a lot of sense. But as he moved forward, he would see more and more of the in-depth sightings, and there wouldn't be a solution for it. He said, well, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand this. And as we moved into the 60s, he began to realize that a lot of the UFO material, the good stuff, wasn't coming to Project Blue Book. That stuff was going somewhere else. We now know, I believe it was going to Project Moondust. But as he looked at the evidence and talked to the witnesses, he became more and more convinced that they were accurately reporting what they had seen. There was an experiment conducted. I shouldn't say experiment because that's really too nice a word, but these two nutballs in New Jersey were launching balloons with flares on them because they wanted to prove how credulous UFO researchers and witnesses were. And when you look at the sighting reports and everything going on, the witnesses were describing exactly what they'd seen. They were very accurate in their descriptions. And the only way you got to the extraterrestrial was the media was asking people, well, do you think aliens are real? And they interviewed some little girl with her lollipop saying, what do you think of aliens? I'm thinking, yeah, this is really in-depth coverage. But I think as Hynek moved forward, he saw that the witness testimony could be trusted. They understood what was going on, and that the information was leading toward the extraterrestrial. I think that's kind of what changed Hynek's mind, was the preponderance of the evidence. I'm told my time is up. I'm going to turn this over to my good friend, Noe Torres, who actually lives in Edinburg, Texas.
I know there were more questions for Kevin, and he'll be back this afternoon and evening, so there'll be other opportunities. I'm really looking forward to his presentation on Roswell because there's actually nobody in the world who knows more about Roswell than Kevin does. And he's probably too modest to admit that, but even Stanton Friedman admits that, you know, he really hasn't kept up with all the latest research and all the latest findings. Stanton was in on the beginning of the Roswell case. He did the research for the first book about Roswell, which was called The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Steinman. But after that, Stanton's interest went in other directions. So really the preeminent Roswell guy now, and the reason that the motion picture company sought him out to be the primary consultant for the movie we're watching this afternoon is because he is the leading expert on Roswell. We've got a great lineup this afternoon. Steve Ondrosco, my good friend, and I will be presenting UFO encounters of the 1800s. Yes, believe it or not, it's not just in movies and comic books. Cowboys really did meet aliens. And we have stories, documented stories that appeared in print back in the 1800s. We'll talk about right after lunch at 12:45. So we're going to break early for lunch, be here at 12:45, and then after that, you're going to want to listen to former Star Trek screenwriter David Bennett Caron. He's going to talk about his meetings with Gene Roddenberry, with Patrick Stewart, with all the big stars of Star Trek, and many other science fiction shows and films that he was involved in writing, producing, directing. So you don't want to miss. It'll be the Cowboys and Aliens, and it'll be Kathleen talking about the famous Betty and Barney Hill story, and then David Bennett Caron. Then we'll have the movie in the big auditorium right behind us, the movie, and then we'll have the evening lecture on Roswell by Dr. Randall. So we'll see everybody here at 12:45. Thanks a lot.